African heads of state and government have adopted a draft declaration supporting connectivity, tourism, and e-visa facilitation. It happened at the 5th Mid-Year Coordination Meeting in Kenya's capital, Nairobi. There, West Africa Regional Bloc Chairman, President Bola Tinubu, presented a report highlighting regional integration progress and emphasized ECOWAS's dedication to stability, democracy, and economic growth in Africa. Joining us now is Professor Bolaji Akinyemi, Nigeria's former Minister of Foreign Affairs. Good morning, Professor Akinyemi, and welcome to the morning show.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me on your show. Good morning, Dr. Abati. Good morning, Rufai. And good morning, Nayo.
Morning, sir. Bless you, sir. Morning, sir.
Thank you for joining us again, Prof. Now, very quickly, what stands out for me at this 5th Mid-Year Coordination Meeting in Nairobi, Kenya, was a call yesterday by President William Ruto for reforms of the African Union. He was talking about funding gaps agreed at the last meeting, which should be addressed. The fact that African Union needs to be more self-reliant. 60% of its budget is picked up by outsiders, by external interests. He's talking about harmonization within the AU to remove duplication of departments. Generally, how to make the institution more effective. In your view, how urgent do you think that reform should be? Because they keep talking about it at various meetings, but nobody is moving the needle in that direction.
Well, before I address the issue that you have raised, let me just say this as a background. During the campaign for the election in Nigeria, we, when I say we, scholars in the field, tried to get the candidates to have either a debate or individual presentation on foreign policy matters, and all of them ignored us. And I remember someone saying, look, they don't have the time for foreign policy. Even when they get into office, domestic affairs is going to take most of their time. And I said, you don't go looking for foreign affairs. Foreign affairs comes looking for you. And you could see, within the first 40 days of Tinubu being in office, he's been to Paris, he's been to Guinea-Bissau, now he's in Kenya, and the G20 is just around the corner, and he has been invited, or Nigeria has been invited, to that meeting. So you could see, even if he wants to concentrate on domestic affairs, foreign affairs is dragging him into the global scene, and this will continue to happen. I recall that when General Obasanjo got into office in 1999, he sent a special nomination to the National Assembly at that time of the foreign minister saying, I need him because I need to do a lot of traveling. I hope that President Tinubu will do that. He can't start going around the world without a functioning foreign minister. He cannot be using the permanent secretary of the ministry as a standby, for the foreign minister. So thank you for allowing me to give that background. The issue you have raised is an issue that some of us have been raising for donkey years. When you look at the people representing the African Union at this summit, you ask, who are these people? Who are they? What is the status of their countries on the global scene? how is not only Africa, but the world going to pay attention to the African Union if you still continue to operate the syndrome that we were operating in 1960 when all African countries, by and large, came onto the scene. The world has moved on. The global affairs has moved on since then. India is sending a rocket to the moon, and Indonesia and Malaysia and even Brazil are major players on the international scene. But the African Union, on the back of the Organization of African Unity, OAU, is still doing this thing of one African country is equal to another African country and what have you. And 60% of them don't pay their dues. But when it comes to the time for election, oh well, it is the turn of Comoros. It is the turn of countries that have no gravitas on the international scene. And I think what Ruto is cleverly and diplomatically drawing attention to is that if the AU, by the way, you recall that what's his name? I'm sorry, President Biden has said he intends to nominate the AU to be a member of the G20 or thereabout. Who is going to be representing the AU at such a conference? A president they've never heard about, coming from a country they've never heard about. So really, there is an urgent need for the internal restructuring of the AU itself. You cannot have multiplicity of commissions just in order to ensure that every African country or every region in Africa, whether they pay their dues or not, has a commission to head. You've got to revisit the fundamentals of the African Union, and you've got to have somebody to press this, just as Gaddafi pressed the transmutation of the Organization of African Unity to the African Union. If he hadn't pressed it, that would not have taken place. So hopefully Ruto and Tinubu, because I was impressed by the takeaway points from the two presentations that Tinubu made at this conference. His reference to the fact that Africa can no longer be proactive if it wants to be taken seriously. It has to identify the issues that it is going to pursue on the global scene. His own rejection of the scramble for Africa, that Africa hasn't forgotten what it suffered under colonialism, and that he personally is committed, to, if you like, pushing back at the so-called scramblers for Africa, identifying the agenda for the African Union in terms of the fight for democracy, the fight against coups, and the fight against terrorism. You can start to see emerging the core issues of the foreign policy that a leader in Africa is going to push. And if they can team up with the Rutos, of the African scene, I think we will be getting somewhere. He has moved from what he said in Guinea-Bissau to now what he said in Nairobi. In Guinea-Bissau, the emphasis was against coups. We must, our ECOWAS must, stand firm against coups. He got a pushback from the what I would call the Democrats in Africa, saying you simply cannot say you are against coups if you are not going to fight for democracy. And that it is the lack of democracy that leads to coups. So in Nairobi, he has now anchored anti-coup with pro-democracy and anti-terrorism.
All right. Thank you very much, Professor Akinyemi. And something else the president touched on in his speech was on trade. And you cannot have a gathering of African leaders like this and not touch on trade. He spoke about the fact that they must address the issue of intra-community trade in Africa, stating that the EU still remains Africa's biggest trade partner, despite the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and just exploring ways to maximize this agreement. What's your take on this in terms of the fact that Africa still does not do business with Africa as it ought to?
Quite apt. Even something I didn't click. I didn't click in my own brain when they did it. He told the gathering that a common border institution had been established between Nigeria and Cameroon, and that it is now functioning, and that marks a link between ECOWAS and the Central African Community. Now, we're not merging, but linking two regional groupings, and that this is what is called for. How Africa is going to, he identified, I can't remember what the issues were, but basically is that we have to deal with the difficult issues of interconnectivity. And recall, he mentioned all these rail links and road links, and he identified the countries in West Africa that the road links have not only been identified, but that progress was in action was in progress, or progress was in action, whichever way you like to put that, for it to be sensible. And I think he was calling for more of these road links that will be the engine of growth, the engine of this interconnectivity. You've got to also deal with the issue which he identified of what do you call it? The e-visa transmission for all African countries, so you will be able to go from one African area to another without having to have this problem of the bureaucratic issues that you have. And it's rather strange that this will be coming a week after Seychelles, I believe, has just banned people with Nigerian passports from coming into their country because in the past few weeks, people carrying drugs into Seychelles have been found to be carrying Nigerian passports. That's an issue that we will have to address, because there is no country that is going to allow free running to their country if they are going then to be faced with drug issue or currency issue without them having to push back against the countries where this drug and currency malfeasance are emanating from.
Okay. The thing we say about foreign policy and foreign policy analysis is the fact that whatever your foreign policy is, there's a direct correlation with your domestic policy. A nation is only as respected as the way it treats its weakest citizens. Don't you think all this talk by African nations and African presidents are all hypocritical while their citizens suffer massively because of their own greed? Isn't it time for us to look at that? Because the reason why America is respected today as a very strong economy is also dependent on how it has treated its citizens over the years. The reason other countries in the West are respected because the citizenry and the corporate sector, the private sector internally is very strong. But in Nigeria, subsidy, lawmakers, 70 billion, corruption. Is it not time for us to look inward before we even have the temerity to speak outwards? Look at Ruto, for instance. For everything Ruto says, look at the suffering within. Look at the suffering within that a lot of Kenyans are going through. For everything the South African president says, look at the suffering within. Africa is just a meager 3.14 trillion GDP. While a company like Apple has market capitalization of $3 trillion. Just one company in America. Is it not time for us to look within? What's your take on this, sir?
Rufai, I seldom disagree with you. But I think you are now going to have a disagreement today. But let me state the area of agreement. There are issues which you have identified which African leaders must face. And I agree with you that we need to pay attention, or we need to pay attention to the standard of living, the GNP, the gross national, the GDP of our citizens. It cannot be at the level of $2,000 or $3,000 that it is. While we have respectable GNPs, is the GDP that you and I agreed needs to be addressed. Number two, I agree with you that the scandalous behavior that has even been shown by the our new representatives in the National Assembly is scandalous. This is not the time it should be happening. This is not the time they should be voting all these big issues. So, big allowances, for themselves. I agree with you. I agree that the state of our economies need to be addressed. But where my disagreement with you is that no country in the world finishes addressing its domestic issues before it plays a global role on the global scene. How many, yes, it's probably a question of balancing and percentages, but given the American economy, it is scandalous the percentage of Americans who are below the poverty level in the United States. But that's no justification for us ignoring our own people. If we can do better, we should do better. But the principle that I'm adumbrating is that there's no country in the world that finishes solving its domestic problems. And I know you can push back at me that that's not what you are saying, but that what you are saying is that it is scandalous the level at which we are operating domestically if we want the rest of the world to pay attention at us. That is work in progress, I believe, and we should address if we want to be taken seriously internationally, we should address, we shouldn't ignore our domestic issues while we go prancing around in the rest of the world. But, look at what had happened in France. Even this year, France has been in a state of domestic turmoil since Macron got into power because of what he had tried to do. And the point I'm making is, the more you try to reform your economy, the more pushbacks you are going to get. One from your domestic opponents, because part of what is happening in Kenya is actually Odinga determined to bring Ruto down rather than waiting for the next election. We should keep an eye on what the opposition does once elections are over and it decides that it's not going to accept the credibility of the victory. All that is going to happen. But we even given the state at which we are in, we can still have roles to play. It is a question of segmentation of the sectors that you are going to concentrate upon. I made allusion to India in the past 3 days sending a rocket to the moon. But you still have considerable poverty in India. I haven't been in India for the past 5 years, but the last time I visited, believe me, the kind of poverty that I saw in India, frankly, I haven't seen it in Nigeria. But, you prioritize certain areas and you concentrate on those areas while not totally ignoring what I will call the underbelly of every country. That underbelly is often rotten in every country, but you try and pull up as many people from that underbelly into the middle class. The middle class in Nigeria has been destroyed since the time of President Babangida. And don't tell me that I served in that government because I was dealing with foreign affairs. I wasn't dealing
Prof, why are you
with
preempting me this morning?
But we should try and rebuild.
Well, Prof.
We should try and rebuild the middle class in Nigeria. It is going to be the essence of stability of this country, and from there we launch off.
Prof, I'd like to ask you a general question. From African Union, we became AU. We tried to move from emphasis on activism for decolonization to trade cooperation. Now, do you really believe that African multilateralism can really work, considering the fact that these countries are competing heavily among themselves? Regional communities, economic communities meeting, COMESA, IGAD, ECAS, ECA, all of them meeting in Nairobi. But they have different agenda. They couldn't even agree on the accreditation that was given to Israel. As we speak now, they are finance ministers of African states and central bank governors. They are in Addis, also holding a meeting on how to deepen cooperation. Is African multilateralism not reduced just to the level of talk shops without concrete outcomes?
We have difficulties. A lot of difficulties in Africa. We are not allowed to pick our leaders. I know that you will say there goes the excuses syndrome, but it is true. At the time we were fighting for independence, you cannot build something on nothing. At the time we were fighting for independence, the colonial authorities made sure they got rid of the radical Africanist leaders. And though they didn't succeed in getting rid of, after independence, they organized coups against them. And up till today, France still determines who rules in his countries or in his former colonies and who he decides to get rid of. We in the English-speaking countries are probably better off in the sense that at least we decide our own leaders. But then, within that, if you like, pot of African leaders, the Pan-Africanist radical leaders, like now Ruto, who seems to be taking on the mantle of Thomas Sankara and Gaddafi, have to coexist with, I'm sorry to use the language, neo-colonialist leaders, who I shouldn't mention the names. They have to coexist with them. And if you are going to have any agreement, then it's going to be at the basic minimum. Osagyefo Nkrumah, Secretary Gamal Abdel Nasser wanted African High Command, African Unity Government in 1962-63. They didn't get it. The minimum they could get was the OAU, which had the minimum definition of Pan-Africanism. And unfortunately, when history is written, Nigeria will be on the side of those who blocked the radical Pan-Africanist movement led by Nkrumah. And of course, as you know, Nkrumah got overthrown shortly after our own coup in 1966. Isolating secretary. What could one man do? And then the emperor also got overthrown. Whatever you may think of the emperor's domestic affairs, he was a committed and genuine Pan-Africanist. So, I don't know. There is no solution. I mean, you can't go and get rid or overthrow the French government and now get a government in France that will look favorably on what Africa is trying to do. We've just got to continue to push back. And that's why I made reference. That's why I made reference to what Tinubu said. To all you scramblers for Africa, we are going to resist you. We are going to push back. But then that is one country. That's one leader. So I hope he can team up with the Rutos and see how far we can go. But it's got to be, it will always have to be incremental.
On that note, I would like to thank you very much, Professor Bolaji Akinyemi, for joining us on the morning.